Do you agree with anybody who comes up with the sentence, he was to blame for being knifed in broad daylight 15 times in his neck?
If you're asking me who's to blame, I say the assailant, much like Douglas Murray said that the Christchurch killer, the one who massacred the Muslims in the mosque, that only the killer was to blame, not those who radicalised him into...
In this video, we are going to watch Douglas Murray in an extremely heated debate with Muslim thinker and speaker Abdullah al-Andalusi.
Sachin Tendulkar to Virat Kohli.
This one took place the week after Salman Rushdie was stabbed on a New York stage, an event that many of you will remember. And for some context about what they're debating here, in 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran issued a fatwa calling for the death of Rushdie after his book, The Satanic Verses, which was declared blasphemous. So this debate, for me, highlights some much bigger issues that we are still facing. So let's get into it.
So for us tonight, there's one big question. Is there such a thing as too much free speech, or should we always defend the right to offend? Now, joining me from New York, I'm joined by conservative author Douglas Murray. To quote Piers Morgan, Douglas, has the world gone nuts, my friend?
You said at the beginning, is there any limit to free speech? And I'm rather disturbed we're still discussing this. It's 3 decades and more since the Satanic Verses affair. It was in 1989 that the Ayatollah Khomeini did the unpardonable, unforgivable thing of calling for the murder of a British novelist for the crime of writing a novel. And we had these debates back then. Where are the limits to free speech? Has Mr. Rushdie committed a crime as well as the Ayatollah? And a lot more guff like that. I'm rather disturbed that in all of the decades since, with all of the people who've been killed for asserting their right to free speech, or asserting their right to say what they think, and for the rest of us to hear it, but we're still at this elementary playground level of discussion. I'm sorry to say that, but this is a long, long answered question. Our societies have perfectly good incitement laws in place. The rest of it, I'm sorry, no, we're not adapting our own speech codes. We're not going to make ourselves more sensitive to people who famously burn books that they can't even read. I mean, the Ayatollah Khomeini had never even read the Satanic Verses when he asked for Muslims around the world to kill Salman Rushdie. It's an unpardonable thing that has happened. It is extraordinary to me that we're still having this discussion. Mm-hmm. We had the same discussion 7 years ago when the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo were being murdered. We had the same discussion in all of these decades, and it's Muslims and non-Muslims who've been attacked. And we in the West still have this pathetic discussion about, oh, what are the limits of free speech? Really, we've got to get better than that.
Douglas, I agree with you, but it's not just Islam, is it? We'll talk to Abdullah al-Andalusi in a minute, but it's also comedy. We talked about Dave Chappelle, we talked about Jimmy Carr. There doesn't seem to be a week that goes by without some comedian making a joke that a certain group, a certain number of people find distasteful. I obviously
that might be true.
I obviously come from a different planet, because here's what I would say.
Guys, just a quick reminder, if you want to see this video go far and wide, then you can help me out by hitting that like button below. And if you're getting value from my channel, and if you want to join in the community, don't forget to hit that subscribe button below. Welcome, and back to the clips.
We have an on-off button. If you want to go and see a comedian, you buy a ticket. If you want to watch a television program, you pick that channel. If you want to read Salman Rushdie's book, you surely have a right. Are we not getting to the point where free speech is under attack in our world, in our nation?
It's been under attack for a long time. I don't particularly care for a lot of the sort of belly aching and complaining on rather frivolous online stuff that I hear from a lot of authors and others. I think that people have to toughen up a bit on some of that. But the Rushdie affair has always been in a different class, and there's a reason for that. And there's a reason why so many people today are willing to make death threats against authors and others for all sorts of things, including comedians. And it's because they saw that it works. Yeah. It works. When the Ayatollah called for the murder of Salman Rushdie, people on the left and right of British politics and British culture made excuses for the fatwa. I'm sure we'll hear some excuses today. They learned, our societies learned, that if somebody says, I'm offended, and then says, and as a result I'm going to kill, you better be damn sure that you're willing to die for that. And unfortunately, the success of the Ayatollah's fatwa, among other things, is that it showed a load of other disgruntled people what they could do if they only had the disgustingness to think that they could exercise violence as an opposition to the pen. And I'm afraid that what happened, as I say, is that Muslim extremists across the UK and across the world showed they could intimidate people, and others undoubtedly have learned from this. But let's remember, Britain in 1989, we allowed Muslims in Bradford to burn the Quran, the satanic verses on the streets of Britain. We allowed prominent figures like Cat Stevens to excuse the murder of Salman Rushdie on the television. We allowed Iranian officials who had called for Rushdie's murder to live in London. Like, how stupid are we?
So many of you will have seen that Douglas Murray has had his hands full recently. He's been in Israel covering the conflict from ground zero, which is something that he's always done as a journalist. And he is a man that is incredibly bullish about liberal democracy and about Western values. And whilst I don't necessarily agree with all of his viewpoints about foreign conflicts, I certainly understand where he's coming from. And I realize and respect that he has been in this fight for a very, very long time, and often with his back up against the wall and very outnumbered. I mean, people all around Europe are just now starting to really wake up to the things that Douglas Murray has been sounding the alarms about for years. Mass immigration, changing demographics, Islamification of Europe, and the strange death of Europe, if you will, his book name, and the erosion of Western values. And now you'll have noticed that this is reaching a fever pitch, with the Israel-Palestine conflict having poured gasoline on that. But also, the most significant way that we're seeing this is all of the nationalist populist candidates that are being elected around Europe. Geert Wilders from Holland, the most recent of which. This is a clear representation of how the majority of people in Europe are feeling about the effects of the immigration crisis. Now, I have no beef with Islam, and I spend a lot of time in Islamic countries. I think we could learn a lot from them. I think they could also learn a lot from us. So whilst I don't love everything they do, I can appreciate it. But I can only appreciate it where it is. It works great in Saudi Arabia, works in Turkey, works in Indonesia, doesn't work in Britain. In fact, it's a recipe for utter disaster, because unlike our cultures, which are rather tolerant to the point of being weak sometimes, they don't compromise on their values. We saw what happened when those dorky activists tried to go over to Qatar and ideologically colonize them by wearing the pride flags at the World Cup. They were dealt with swiftly, as they should have been. You don't go to someone else's country and spit in the face of their values, and if you do, there should be consequences. But the difference between them and us is that they don't take that sort of bullshit like at all. If you keep up with that pride stuff, you know what the outcome will be. I don't need to spell it out for you. We in the West, though, tend to be more self-flagellating rather than standing up for our values. And anybody who does try and stand up for it, we call them racist. Our overt tolerance has been our downfall. And I do believe that tolerance is a good thing, but it has to have a limit. Western civilization is not going to survive at this rate. That's just the stark reality. Whilst we're here arguing what a woman is,
I'm a mother.
And why we are inherently racist as white people.
What are white people superior at?
Exactly what white people are superior at.
They're real good at violence.
Violence. Genocide. It's like stealing people's lives just because they feel like
Being ignorant.
Blame.
letting their egos control their every move. Superior at being
And taking millions of refugees and letting drag queens read stories to our children. They're making moves. Whilst we've absolved ourselves of the duty of having children because of climate change, or because we'd rather go on 2 holidays a year and go and sip mango daiquiris on a beach, and whilst we are well below replacement rate, Middle Eastern and African countries are going for broke. They're having babies. They're also forming geopolitical alliances and trying to challenge US global hegemony, not to mention the power that they're garnering in the UK and around Europe. And whilst a lot of people will hate them and will judge them for that, I don't. You might think less of me for this, but I say fair play to them. They're doing what they should be doing, which is expanding their influence and serving their interests and their people. That's the world that we live in. It will never change. Everyone is doing that. And the moment you become weak and masochistic, you lose. The moment you start placing diversity and equity and inclusion above all else, and you become pussified, some savage is going to come along and eat your lunch. And as somebody who's traveled around the world a lot and seen many corners of the globe, I am of the opinion that not all cultures are equal. I don't believe that it's all relative. Western civilization has built the best societies that have ever graced God's green earth. So I, for one, am pretty keen to uphold them. So how do we balance strength, power, and self-interest with tolerance, virtue, and magnanimity? And is that even possible? Well, I think that is the great question of our time. So feel free to have a crack at that one in the comments. Now let's watch the rest of this debate where things get really heated.
Interesting, Douglas. Thank you for Now in New York. Let's pick up now with journalist Martha Gill, Emma Wedd from the Free Speech Union and co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative, Abdullah Al-Andalusi. Let's start with you, if we can, Abdullah. Quite a strong rhetoric from Douglas Murray. I'm always aware that Muslim extremists do not in any way speak for the majority of Muslims. But to be fair, the Iranian government over the weekend said Rushdie was to blame for being attacked. That is completely and utterly despicable, isn't it?
Well, firstly, I find it rather strange that Douglas Murray, who's had a history of advocating for restrictions on Muslim speakers at universities...
But you can answer my question. Do you think it's despicable that the Iranian government have said that he took it on himself? He was stabbed in broad daylight. Do you find that despicable?
But if I may, he deigns to say he's a champion for free speech, so to speak, but yet his organisation argued for restrictions on, for platforms for Muslim speakers going to universities. He wanted to ban the burqa in public buildings and a kind of social ban on it in public. So for him, and argued that conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board.
Let's bring Douglas back in. Douglas, wait.
I find it a little. I find it a little bit strange that he should deign to call himself, brazenly call himself, or at least imply he's some kind of champion for free speech. Or free expression.
Look, I've probably got to answer that. You'll have noticed, and all of your viewers will have noticed, that this Islamist lunatic in your studio can't answer the basic question. Let's try it again and make it simple for you. Why don't you say whether or not you are completely condemning of any violence against Salman Rushdie or anyone else who is deemed to have said something heretical? Why don't we start with the basics for you?
Okay, firstly, I want to answer his question, because he asked me first, which is about the Iranian regime. Well, having not being an Iranian citizen, nor participated in any elections to elect the Iranian regime, the Iranian regime doesn't really represent 1.8 billion Muslims. And
okay, so if you're here representing 1.8 billion Muslims, it's very simple. Douglas has just said it. All right, as your own self, having heard what he said, do you accept people saying, be it the Iranian government or Muslim extremists, and I made the caveat and I repeat it, Muslim extremists, that one of the biggest problems I have is that people look at the whole thing and they shouldn't. Do you agree with anybody who comes up with the sentence, he was to blame for being knifed in broad daylight 15 times in his neck? Do you?
The only person to blame for the knifing of Salman Rushdie is the assailant himself.
Not the Iranian regime who put the fatwa on him in the first place.
Well, unless you can demonstrate that they were specifically colluding or they sent an agent.
They said he was to blame.
He was in communication with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
That's their opinion, right? But I'm only here to talk about, if you're asking me who's to blame, I say the assailant, much like Douglas Murray said that the Christchurch killer, the one who massacred the Muslims in the mosque, that only the killer was to blame, not those who radicalized him into viewing Muslims as a threat to the West.
What you'll find is that if somebody put millions of dollars on someone's head, yours for instance, or mine, and somebody then attacked us, you would think that the person who had put millions of dollars on our head would bear some responsibility. But because you're such a dishonest weasel, you're not even willing to do that. You're not even willing to do the basic thing of condemning the attack.
Sticks and stones, Douglas Murray, sticks and stones.
Why don't we
You need to demonstrate that the person was motivated by the reward.
I'll tell you what I'd like to motivate. I'll tell you what I'd like to demonstrate.
So Douglas not holding back as usual. And this, for me, guys, is a microcosm of a much bigger problem. And the case of Salman Rushdie is a perfect one, because for me, it perfectly illustrates how multiculturalism, when it comes to Western values and Islamic values, is destined to fail. The ways in which we structure our societies and our value structures are completely different. Our Western values of free speech and individuality, personal freedom, and liberal democracy require that somebody like Salman Rushdie can write a book as inflammatory and controversial as the one he wrote and not fear for his life. And whether the subject matter of the book is true or false, I don't know, and I don't particularly care. But what I do care about is that we must have a unifying baseline of cultural values that we can all agree upon. Otherwise, we are surely on a one-way road to civil war and self-destruction. So on that very positive note, guys, don't forget that you can find me below. You can subscribe to the channel right here. And also, if you'd like to watch another video, you can click right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.